Thanks so much for having me, Noah. And I'll try and zoom us out a little bit more before we zoom back in. And so this is talking about what happens when we domesticate plants. So this is one of my favorite maps that a researcher named Colin Curry made, looking at where some of our really popular food plants come from. And one of the things that you can see is they come from everywhere. Every single culture in the world has domesticated plants, and they've done a wonderful job at it. And they have plants that really resonate with their specific cultures and their specific environments. But it's something that everyone knows how to do. They might use different language surrounding it, but they know how to do it, and they do it incredibly well. And as we've started to look at plants over time, we see certain patterns. So again, when we look at the genetics, one of the things that happens is if we look at our wild potatoes, right, we can start off with this tremendous diversity, but what happens is people select, say, a specific thing. Maybe they really like the purple potato. If you don't, and you see two different patterns emerge, and it forms this bottleneck. And so what does that mean? It means that in areas where you have something selected, these black dots on the right here, what ends up happening is you reduce the total genetic diversity. And in places where you don't select it, you have tons and tons of different diversity that's present. And so what happens is the more we select for a specific trait, we actually reduce that diversity. Now that's both good and bad. It's good because we get the things that we want as people. It's bad because sometimes when we talk about building resilient agriculture, we leave some stuff behind that might be super useful. So it's just important to note that basically how intensely you select changes this diversity. And another thing that's really important is as you take smaller and smaller numbers of parents, you also reduce diversity. So the different parts of the world have different access to amounts of diversity. With that being said, that hasn't stopped people from domesticating every single type of plant across the world, and basically for any sort of trait you could imagine. So this is one of a favorite paper of mine from about 15 years ago that basically just shows it doesn't matter if you're an annual, if you're a perennial, if you're a tree, if you're a biennial, if you're selecting for fruit, seed, root parts. We've selected hundreds and hundreds of species, dozens and dozens of those, and every culture has their own favorite way of picking traits that fit that particular context. But this has actually led to a problem. So when we look at the way basically universities have studied science or domestication, we talk about something called the domestication syndrome. So this is a classic set of traits, mostly from grasses, that have occurred. So what you're seeing here in this A panel is teosinte, the wild relative of maize, and modern maize. They do not look a whole lot alike, right? But there's this, you see this gigantism. You can see that in the tomatoes as well. You see this gigantism. You see the seeds are getting bigger. If you're looking at this B, so this is Oryza, wild rice and wild Asian rice, and the cultivated rice, where their seeds are falling off, and now they're all being held really tightly on the plant. If you're looking at sunflower, you go from this really big multi-headed plant to a single-headed plant. But what's happened is by focusing on these traits in kind of some of these dominant global crops, we've really ignored how different cultures have done domestication. So what's really, really important moving forward is that we recognize, so this is a figure that was made by a colleague of mine, Amber Nashoba, where she shows now a different Zizania, wild rice from North America, that shows two different ways that this plant was domesticated, basically by the Anishinaabe. So they domesticated it for their cropping system, where they wanted it to reseed as they were harvesting in the lakes and rivers of northern North America. So they selected for partial shattering, because as they harvested, they wanted it to reseed so they could harvest next year. Whereas when farmers in California and Minnesota came in, they selected very strongly for that non-shattering type that we saw in domestic rice so they could use machinery. So just something that I want everyone to think about. We reduce the diversity, but the environment and the cropping systems that we choose shape what we culturally want, and that shapes the genetic of our plants. It's a co-evolution between people and plants. And so I'll end there.
To see you, Kavika, that we are doing today. Thank you, Kavika, for sharing the Manao. It's always wonderful.